We've asked a panel of experts their opinion on Nelle's conundrum about star rate. Nelle, you're experiencing a conundrum of should you star rate, and how does that add to your review?
Yeah, and communicating quality and experience and sort of evaluating books in general. It's something that we've been talking about a little bit on this channel lately, and we thought we would get some outside opinions from these people.
Hi, my name is Elle. I have the channel Elle Thinks.
Hello, I'm Hannah from the channel Hannah's Books.
Hi, Rose here.
I'm Sean the Book Maniac.
Many things to worry about.
I sometimes quite like a sort of meandering, sort of rambly style as how I talk.
Hi, Scott and Nelle. Thank you for inviting me here to answer this question. Do I have to be here? I would actually rather you weren't. Well, then I'll stay.
Hey there, I'm Olivia Savannah here from Olivia's Catastrophe, answering some questions from the wonderful Scott and Nelle.
We asked a bunch of booktubers because we think we wanted a variety of opinions and a variety of approaches, and I think we've gotten responses that cover that.
If we ask them, it's because they're a good reviewer in general. We've given them 3 questions to discuss.
And the first one is about what sort of language they use when they're evaluating whether a book is good or bad.
I think the first 2 people we're going to hear from had very interesting responses.
Yeah, interesting.
Alright, well, I'll make this quick. The question asked is, what language do you use to convey to your audience the various levels of quality in a book? English. Yeah, okay. It really does depend on the audience, which is determined by the genre and age the book is aimed at. But there are a few crossing similarities no matter what the book contains. Typically there are a few words I do try to avoid, like the word interesting. Now I don't mean like when someone says it's interesting in how such and such is done, but if used then an explanation is definitely needed. As if not, the word interesting just becomes an unintentional insult. You don't believe me? Next time you're at an art gallery that the artist is at, walk up to them and tell them that their work is interesting. And just leave it at that. It won't end well. Yeah? Is that experience? Yeah. Any adjective that is used without explanation or is not followed by either an example or reason is quite useless. Yeah, all art is quite useless, yeah, alright. Of course, adjectives are necessary, just not on their own. Which may sound like an obvious point, but it's something that I see way too often. Yeah, a 40-minute review that says absolutely nothing. Simply because the adjectives are left without reason. I found this book really interesting. Fascinating characters, provocative storyline, and real powerful prose. Because of this, there are so many books that I know about, but know nothing about. Now I know the question is what kind of language do I use when trying to convey the significance of a book, not what language I don't use. When I discuss a book, though typically it's not on the quality necessarily, I more so try to convey what the author was either trying to communicate, and in that case I'll use language similar to what someone watching would expect. There's clearly a huge difference in the language I use when I was discussing science fiction novels to when I was discussing literary theory.
I use loads of adjectives, but I've realised that the one that I use most, in fact, one might say overuse, I think, is interesting.
Okay.
Let's hope that our panel don't have any fights.
Which is funny because it's a bit of a meaningless word, standing alone, isn't it? Interesting. Interesting because of what? It tells you nothing. But what that reveals is that the thing that matters to me most when reading a book is does it catch my interest? And that could be because of style or structure or plot or characters or ideas, lots of different things. If I don't like a book because I'll describe it as plodding or pedestrian or predictable, and if I get as far as saying a book is dull, then I'm probably going to DNF it, but mostly I manage not to pick up dull books. That's my sort of bottom line. There are qualities that, or characteristics that a book might have that could go either way for me. Like I'm quite up for something more experimental, say, or non-linear. And if I talk about it being rich or vivid or adventurous, or those are positives. Whereas if I say it's convoluted and a bit overwrought or overworked, it's gone the other way. Similarly, a messagey book, if I say it's passionate, that's a thumbs up. If I say it's preachy, definite thumbs down. I might say a book was discursive and digressive, and that would be quite positive. If I go as far as rambling, we've tipped over the edge into the negatives.
They both actually make the same point, that some words, particularly words that we get into habitually using, don't actually mean anything on their own. And while they are intended to convey something vaguely positive, they don't actually communicate as much to our audience as we would like. I think this is part of what worries me about ratings, because I think that sometimes we feel that, 5 stars, well, that tells you what I think. It actually doesn't. And it's the same with these stand-in words, interesting.
When I am watching somebody else do a review, what I want to know about their review is not if they enjoyed the book, it's if I'm going to enjoy the book.
Yeah, so we're actually more interested in a description of their experience, maybe, and a description of the work itself.
Because we all have different tastes. If we use interesting, for example, like, if I find a book interesting, you might find it boring as dog feces, which doesn't have to be boring, by the way.
Yes, it does.
Tell you a lot about the dog. Fossilized dog feces tells us about the diet of...
Anyway. What have we got? Who have we got next?
We have a bunch of booktubers that have...
who've actually given us some words.
Yeah, everybody has answered these questions in their own way and taken their own interpretation. And this is the problem with picking very creative and interesting people.
It's not a problem. This is great.
Some of the phrases that I tend to repeat the most was, I did not like this at all, which is to do with my 1-star rated books. So thankfully I don't have to say that too often on my channel. I also use the term new favorite 5 stars. This is for when I absolutely loved a book and I want to tell my audience. And other key phrases that I tend to use is unexpected directions. This can mean anything from I couldn't predict anything in this book at all, or there was a major plot twist or more than one plot twist, or it was just impossible to tell where the plot was going, but I was having a good time with that. That's to just express that it was unexpected, you don't know what's going to happen going in, and it's very good fun. I also mention when books are slow reads, but if I say a slow read, I like to specify that that was a negative thing. But sometimes I say it was like slow magic, slow and steady, and that works for a book, because I don't think slow paced necessarily means it was bad. Sometimes that works in a book's favour and sometimes it doesn't. I also use lyrical writing a lot. That tends to do with anything that has purple writing, that's heavy in imagery. Warn my audience ahead of time about that, because while that is very much my cup of tea and it's certain people's cup of tea, it isn't for others, and it's a nice thing to know before you go into a book.
I looked at some of my Goodreads reviews. I rewatched some of my videos to try to see if there's specific language that I use, and I wrote down some adjectives I have, but most of the time it's really I'm describing what the book is about, thematically. So sometimes I was using descriptive words to talk about the reading experience. So for those, I would say I was captivated or charmed, or it was engrossing or compulsive, it was intriguing. I like to use intriguing a lot. And then on the opposite end, when I didn't like the book as much, I would say things are meh, fine, or mundane. If I was talking about the plot itself, I had words like disjointed, they attempted to tackle too much, the pacing was off, it was succinct, repetitive, flat, haphazard, predictable, lackluster, hollow, jarring, forced. And then I had some for dialogue and I really only talk about dialogue when I don't like it, and 2 words that I used a few times are clunky and stilted. I think that sometimes I don't use adjectives to focus on quality of the book. I talk about if it's plot heavy or character focused, or kind of what I thought was the main focus of the book as me as a reader, and as what I interpret the author focusing on, and I kind of hone in on that. I tend to focus on what I thought the main point of the book was in my reviews in an attempt to show if you like this, then you would like this book.
I feel like I could talk about the differences in these responses all day. It's really interesting to me. Olivia seems so conscious ahead of time of how she presents books, whereas both Roz and Elle have had to reflect on their content to sort of respond to these questions, and I think that that's a really interesting difference in approach, but it has nothing to do with my conundrum.
No, it doesn't. But I think it is actually worth discussing a bit further, because I think Olivia has set out like a framework of language wherewith Roz and Elle have reflected on the framework of language that they have accidentally created. It feels quite deliberate with Olivia, and not that like all three of them produce very similar good reviews that allow me to know something about the book.
Yeah, they're all reviewers that make it easy to choose books you like. And the focus is clearly for all of them on helping their audience decide whether they will or will not like a book.
Especially Roz, you can almost see like there's this association with the word. Does rambly mean that it is a positive thing to Roz? There is an inbuilt consistency, because to Roz and to Elle, those words can have meanings attached to them. They end up becoming quite consistent, which is actually talking about a later prompt that we've asked them.
I think it's really interesting.
You better follow that up with a... Sorry.
I was finding the thought and you like interrupted me, and now it's dead.
I'm sorry.
You killed the thought. You stabbed it in the face.
I think that there's one booktuber though who had a similar answer but quite different at the same time.
I mean, he's a bit different.
You just like to be shady, don't you? If Nelle ever insults you, it means she likes you.
Regarding the language that I use, I feel as though I'm extremely hyperbolic. I feel as though that's like, it's very, despite the fact that I don't particularly like it, and I think that superlatives can just reduce it into being a general broad statement. I think they're the easiest way to convey to someone, but more so I think in my reviews, despite how hyperbolic I am, I think you'll be able to feed off my body language. It's my demeanour, it's my body language that actually conveys it more so.
This is interesting to me for a bunch of reasons. The first one is you and Kieran both do the hyperbole into sweeping statement generalization, which I make fun of you for all the time, but that impacts the way I review, because we review together as a conversation.
So if I say something like, the book is so dreadful that all copies should be burnt and anybody reading it should have that part of their brain cut out or something like that.
That puts me in a position where I have to either agree with you and usually for humour's sake one up you, or disagree with you
and for humour's sake one up me.
That often obscures what I really think, like the nuance of what I really think of a book.
A classic example of this was Terra Nullius by...
Oh, such a good example. Because you hated it. You thought it was a stinking pile of... And I thought it was fine. By the end of our review, it was very much a battle for...
Yeah, we were.
And I guess that's one of the reasons why I think that star ratings might be helpful to communicate to our audience. The other thing that Kieran talks about is how his body language is.
I think if anybody is unsure whether Kieran is correct, they just need to go and have a look at his live stream for the Booker to see which book won the Booker. And when he finds out, you'll take a guess at his emotion and his feeling and what he thinks of that.
Yeah, I don't think Kieran could do radio.
I think Kieran is definitely much more suited to television than radio.
Yeah.
Also, I think, can we take a moment to just appreciate how good Kieran's art is in the background of this photo? The cover of To Kill a Mockingbird as a piece of art, I think that's wonderful.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
I think Kieran kind of fits in with Roz, Elle and Olivia with what he was saying, but he uses a different form of language. Body language is still a language.
I also think that his manner of speaking is much more akin to the way that you and I express ourselves. I have a tendency to like over-exaggerate and hyperbolize, and so do you.
I think is what makes him entertaining, to be honest.
And I think that mitigating that with some kind of something, for Kieran it's body language. For me, I'm thinking it might be a star rating.
Well, let's see what Sean has to say.
I use subjective language only when I am reviewing a book on my channel, or the few times that I read a Goodreads review, because I don't care about, there's no such thing as objectivity in reviewing. It doesn't exist. It's the biggest fallacy out there. So I talk about what I loved and what I didn't like and what made me comfortable, uncomfortable, subjective. There's nothing else to evaluate when it comes to literature. So adjectives I use, heartwarming, challenging, I don't know, anything like that. Definitely veering over to the subjective side of things.
Reading is a hobby. Having a BookTube channel is a hobby. Reviewing books is a hobby. So it's like not that deep. I find the conversations around like objectivity and things like that interesting when it comes to books, but it doesn't keep me up at night. This isn't that deep to me. I don't actually care that much on how objective or subjective my review is, as long as people enjoy the way that I review and are able to connect with books based on that.
I think it's really interesting because I think that the thing I enjoy most about Sean's reviews is he really does evoke his own experience. And that's why his rant reviews, when he bails on something, are so enjoyable to watch, because the language he uses is very evocative of his own experience, and that's what he's talking about with subjectivity.
I actually think Sean and Kieran have quite a similar style in their reviews, because they evoke a similar feeling to me, because I get quite caught up in the tale of their review rather than
necessarily the book. Yeah,
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I want that experience rather than necessarily.
Or I don't want that experience. Sean is often more entertaining when I don't want to read his.
I think what Elle has to say about it not being that deep really totally applies here. This conundrum of mine is definitely something that is probably taking up more brain space than it needs to. But for me, refining the way that I communicate to my audience is important. And I also, I don't want to feel that I'm getting in the way of anyone connecting with books.
Yeah.
By getting it wrong. So we're looking at how we do it.
Let's see what Hannah has to say.
In my other life, I write book criticism for newspapers and literary journals, but what I choose to do here is different. Instead of a formal judgment, I tend to talk more about personal responses to a book. I don't mean just like I liked it or I didn't like it. I want to talk about what a book sparked in me, what large questions it might have made me think about, or perhaps what links I see with other books.
I feel like when I review books, definitely the language that I use to indicate the quality serves to reinforce or justify my star rating of a book. And usually I feel like I'm pretty consistent in using the same kind of terminology to describe sort of levels of quality.
I will normally talk about the quality of the language in terms of the writing style, and particularly whether I think that writing style is inventive or clever. For example, if there are lots of sort of tired cliches, or I feel like the writing is just sort of fairly bog standard, that might not necessarily appeal to me as much. But I think where it's sort of really strong for me is where the form and the function kind of meet quite nicely. So, for example, a book that is really tight and tense, and the language itself mirrors that, or where we're meant to feel this sort of generous sort of feeling about a sort of character, and the language is sort of meeting that in some ways by being quite sort of florid and vibrant. Or equally, you know, where something's quite brutal and cold in a book, or a character somewhat removed, and we see that echoed in the language. I think that's normally the kind of thing that I like to sort of try and see, and when it's done really well, that's something that really appeals to me. And then as a result, that's something that is how I talk about that book normally, or try to. But that's normally the thing that will most jump out and I most want to talk about.
I think it's really interesting. I can keep going back to that word, interesting.
Yeah, it's going to be a blight on this.
Oh my god! I blame Pay.
Yeah.
He's put it in my brain.
Explain why everything is interesting now.
Oh my god! All of these booktubers have come from a different starting point and have different aims when communicating about books, and it is really reflected in the language that they use to describe and evaluate the books. Hannah goes so far to say as that she doesn't
review books at all, really.
she doesn't evaluate the quality or make a judgment. But I do think that when you're describing your experience, the whether it was a positive or a negative experience does creep in, no matter how much you try to avoid that.
I think the interesting thing about Hannah, and when your job is around books, and one of your sources of joy is books, trying to differentiate between work and pleasure.
I definitely think that Hannah is looking to scratch an itch that she doesn't get to in her work life, and potentially the same is true for Courtney. There is an aspect of discussion that they don't get in their sort of more academic professional lives.
Yeah, I mean...
And that comes through in how they communicate. But also the structures that they've built up in academia come through in how they communicate too.
I think that's quite interesting, and because Hannah is reading different books, and Courtney in a different video has called herself, and I love this quote, "I am a lazy pleasure reader." You know, for somebody who is an English professor, there is that divide. Now, Bob was completely different.
Bob really wants to convey for you the feeling of the writing, I think. The way he talks about a book almost mirrors the style of the book. Gets a bit meta.
I think it's actually quite interesting. Bob has decided to discuss the language that he uses to talk about a book by discussing what he thinks of the language in the book.
The thing that we sort of asked of our panel next was whether this language we've been talking about, how it interacts with any rating system that they have, if they have one.
I would say it's definitely about fleshing things out, because I might say that something is a 3-star book, say, as in, not perfect, flawed, but that there's still things about it that were really interesting and make it worth reading. So, and I want to convey that, so I might say, it would be something like, the writing was a bit clumsy, but the ideas were really passionate, so that interested me. Or the plot's a little predictable, but I was so interested in the setting, and it was really insightful about the politics of the era it was writing about, say. And then, quite often it's about qualifying a judgment to say it's still, these are the reasons why it's still worth reading. If it's a good book, a book that I think is really, really good and I really rate, I'm always conscious that the books that I like most might be ones that don't work for everybody. So again, I'm using those descriptions to avoid leading viewers up a garden path to something that they're not going to enjoy. So I might say, this was an exceptional book for me. I loved the complex non-linear plot, but this is not a book for you if you value a character-driven novel rather than something that's more about the language, say. So I'm trying to give an honest and balanced picture through the language that I use to describe it.
Roz's keyword here is balance. Almost contradicting your rating with your description of a book does help to balance each other out. And I definitely think if you're sort of an exaggerated communicator, or that it provides scale to your thoughts.
I think one of the things that Roz has sort of started to hint at, or flat out spoken about, that a lot of people have discussed in their answers, is the idea that you are reviewing a book for your public and that you won't have the same tastes as them.
That everyone has different priorities.
You're still trying to convey the quality in the book.
But across all those aspects, it's not a single dimension that you're evaluating.
So Roz was really a balanced view. Kieran's answer to this was quite similar, but also incredibly different at the same time. So let's check that one out.
Yeah.
I don't know if it does inform my rating. I've already thought about what I've rated a book and what I feel about it prior towards talking about it for a review. But also a lot of people in my comments say that I kind of do like 180 reviews, where it feels as though I'm taking you one way and then pulling it back. I don't know.
I think Kieran has basically said the same thing as Roz here, except instead of contradicting yourself for balance, he's doing it for drama.
His analysis of the book and what the book is doing is independent of whether he enjoyed what it was doing.
And I guess that's another thing that is the root of my star rating conundrum, is are you rating quality as a shared experience or enjoyment as your own personal? I mean, I'm not trying to say that quality is an objective. I think there are objective elements to quality when it comes to a book. I don't really think that it's an objective. I don't think any one person can objectively assess the overall quality of a book. It's one of the problems I have with doing star ratings at all.
Yeah, I mean, this idea of objective and subjective has come up a lot, hasn't it?
It has. The rest of our panel had some different approaches.
I don't actually give star ratings, but I do keep a spreadsheet of the books I read, and I have dislike, neutral, liked, and loved. And that's like kind of my rating method. I don't have like a hated because I typically DNF those, and to me, like disliked and hated, there's not much of a difference. So, I mean, I guess that would be like a star rating system. It would go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I just don't want to quantify it, I guess. For language that I use that's obviously negative, those end up in the disliked or the neutral section, because like I can dislike a part of the book, but still find the book have value in other sections and have positive or neutral things to say about it. Like when I say something's fine or meh, that's probably like I felt neutrally about the book. And then there's not much of a differentiation in language between the books I liked and the books that I loved, even though the feeling that I'm left with as I'm reading the book is quite different.
For me, star ratings are so intuitive that if you ask me about a book I read 8 years ago, I mean, I joined Goodreads about 6 years ago, and I populated it with all the books from my memory that I'd read in my whole life, and I'm still adding, 5 or 10 a year that I remember, I read that one. And I immediately know the star rating, and you could test me, because it's very subjective. A 5-star book, I loved. It may not have been a perfect book, but I loved it. A 4-star book, I liked, but didn't love. Perhaps I loved it, and there was so many flaws I had to knock a star off. 3-star book, I didn't like. 2-star book, I really didn't like, and a 1-star book, I hated. And that's how I evaluate. And so, if you ask me about any book, I will tell you the star rating immediately. Now, sometimes a book ages well or poorly in my memory, and I do upgrade or downgrade, but that's like 1 or 2 books a year, maybe.
Definitely the language that I use to indicate the quality serves to reinforce or justify my star rating of a book. For me to give a book 1 star, which I think I've only done once in the whole time I've been on BookTube, it has to be like personally offensive to me in some way, in that it's just very poorly written or poorly researched. If I give a book somewhere in the 2-star range, it basically means that it like disappointed me in some way. If I give a book 3 to 3.25 stars, it means that I didn't love it, I didn't hate it, it was kind of just okay. And then if I give it either 3.5 or 3.75, that means I liked elements of it for the most part, but I didn't find it the quality that I tend to use for my 4-star reads, which is I did not find it compulsively readable. And if I give a book 4 stars, I will pretty much always say that it was compulsively readable. That's definitely a consistent term that I use in my description of books that hit the 4-star mark for me. And then if it was 5 stars, 5 stars for nonfiction means that it was well researched and well argued and challenged my thinking or taught me something new or something in that realm. 5 stars for fiction means that it emotionally moved me or even emotionally devastated me.
I do see this as sort of informing my star rating in some ways, because sometimes if a book is really, it's a good story told fairly well, that for me feels like a good solid 4 stars. But for example, I think I would only really go to a 5-star rating if I feel that either something in the plot or the way that the novel is sort of what the novel is doing is so extraordinary that I think it deserves a 5, or so new and groundbreaking. Or, for example, if it's a sort of a normal story told fairly well, but the language is really exciting, that's normally what will tip it over into a 5-star for me. I sometimes don't necessarily care too much about plot. Something like A Passage North, for example, is quite low on plot, I guess. But for me, the language was so exciting that made it a 5-star. And I think I'm happier with language done well than I am plot. That's the thing I'm looking for more, I think, than, for example, the plot.
So much to talk about. The communication of the difference between like and love in a book. I think that's important to me. When Elle was talking about how she communicates those two things is not very different, but the feeling is very different. It really, like, big bells went off in my brain that this is part of what is missing for me in not rating. Part of what is missing for me is I think it is not always clear when I'm talking about a book that I'm saying every fucker should read this book before they die, otherwise they're missing out on, like, an important part of life, versus, yeah, it was good. Yeah. You know, like versus love.
I know what you mean, and that's 4 versus 5 stars for me.
Yeah, and I mean, and clearly, that's not even 4 versus 5 for all of our panelists. Like, everyone's rating system is so different and so subjective. It's really interesting.
And I was thinking, as I was watching it, everybody has their own their set of criteria to be a certain number of stars.
Yeah, that was the group of panelists who most felt like their star rating system was connected to their language.
The idea of what is a 4-star book for all the panel is interesting. But if I pick on just one little point there, and I could pick any point, but let's pick Courtney saying a book has to be compulsively readable for 4 stars. What does compulsory readable mean?
Oh, I understand that phrase in my soul.
I know what it means for me. What does it mean for Courtney?
Yeah, okay.
And how is a book compulsively readable for Courtney? Is it compulsory readable for me? What is
the relationship between her compulsively readable and your compulsively readable?
And so I think that the only way you can really learn that, and I think this is something that we know about BookTube, is that the more you watch and interact with BookTubers, the more you get used to how they discuss books and what those things mean, and you get to learn the nuances of their opinions. And therefore, their opinions mean more to you because you're better able to understand and interpret them.
Yes.
And I think that these 4 BookTubers here breaking down how they...
I definitely think that's why 5 stars as a rating is such a common trend in reviews of all kinds, because most reviews you consume, whether it's about, the quality of a camera or a restaurant, you don't get the context of understanding the person who's reviewing it. That attempt to create some sort of shared scale, the more we talk about it, is less and less shared between person to person. It's so interesting.
And it's like, I often think 3 stars is the ultimate confusing one. Like, I can rate a book that I liked 3 stars and a book that I disliked 3 stars. So I'm being inconsistent in myself there. And other booktubers will have different ratings. Olivia had a very similar take, but a different and unique take at the same time.
Yes.
So let's see what Olivia said.
That mostly applies to the first 2 terms that I said, that I did not like this at all, really goes aligned with 1 star, and new favourite 5 star really goes along with absolute favourites. I don't tend to tell people too often when it's a 2, 3 or 4 star read, so my language for all 3 of those are just the adjectives that you heard when I was talking about anything else, and that can show if it was good or bad. It just really depends on the vibe I give across while discussing the book, because in the end I think ratings are very subjective and it's not the most useful thing to know when it comes to whether or not someone else will like a book. It's more so how you describe the book that will give people a better insight into whether or not it's for them. I just want them to know when I really didn't like something, but I also really want them to know when I highly recommend something. Hence why I share my 1 and 5 star rating.
Ooh, I think this is my favourite tactic.
I think this is so interesting. It really is.
I think it acknowledges what we were just talking about with the difference between like and love, and it communicates where I feel like the gaps in my communication are without becoming ruled by a rating, without it becoming derivative, or what's the word I'm looking for?
Interesting.
Without it becoming interesting.
I think that this is good because...
Reductive.
I think it pushes responsibility of your review back onto your language. If you cut out all reviews for anything that's not a 1 or a 5-star review. But at the same point, I think this is really good because when Olivia is saying positive things about a book, I can see that she likes it. And then when we don't hear the new favourite at the end of the book, we're like, oh, it wasn't a 5-star.
But it was a good book. It was a positive experience.
I think it's actually because it's doing what you want to do. It's qualifying your thoughts. So maybe that's what you need to do.
Maybe.
I don't know.
Who knows?
All right, so there are some booktubers out there that thought quite differently to everybody else.
Shocking.
For me, my goal here on BookTube is primarily to connect with other readers. I'm much more interested in having bookish conversations. So I really never use stars or something like that, since my goal here is not evaluation. Even in my professional reviewing life, I never use a scale or rubric to determine whether a book deserves a positive review.
This isn't really a scale or something that I measure per se, as much as it is more just intuitive, or even more so a kind of unspoken relationship with the audience.
This idea of connecting with the audience, I really like that. We're making these booktube videos. Most people are either not monetized or earn such a little amount from the monetization.
Yeah, this is not a job.
Pointless. The idea of just going in to connect with people is actually like
what
that's
most
why
of
we're
us
all
are here
here,
for.
isn't it?
I definitely think that's true. But your audience, for the most part, are looking for two things. They're looking for people to discuss books they've already read with, or they're looking to decide whether they're going to read the book that you're talking about. Because we've got to be conscious of being as spoiler-free as possible, often those first discussions, the discussions of books you've already read, occur behind the scenes. It's your Voxer conversations and even some of the comments conversations, Instagram messages, those things. That's where we really get into the meat of books we've already read with other people who have also read them. And the content that we make tends to be mostly about recommending or not recommending. But I think it's valid and a good reminder that we are here just to talk about books.
When creating content is where this comes into consideration the most, because I think most booktubers would probably just, what do I feel like creating? What have other people created? Have I been tagged in anything?
Yeah.
Wherewith I think Hannah really honestly would ask herself the question, what do I want to have a conversation about today, tomorrow?
I definitely think that is a very considered part of Hannah's creation process.
All right, that brings us on to question 3.
That the next bunch of videos really highlight how a booktuber's idea of their role as a booktuber and why they review impacts the language they use and whether they use a scale or a rating.
You can absolutely detest a book or think a book is bad, but there is a reader for that book. And so I don't like to come onto my channel and totally bash a book because I could end up recommending that to someone. There's been plenty of books that I have recommended to people who are typically non-readers that I myself didn't appreciate, but based on their taste, I figure they might.
There's a lot of intuitive critique that goes into even the most rigorously thought out formal book criticism. I write formal reviews of brand new or forthcoming work, but when I'm reading for pleasure, I often read older books from Homer all the way to the early 21st century, but almost never within the last few years. I suspect people here who watch me talk about George Eliot or Virginia Woolf or Toni Morrison aren't wanting to hear a straight evaluation. Thank goodness, because they'll usually just see me add my voice to what's already a really large conversation about the meaning of literature in our lives.
Is the language consistent and measured? I'm Sean the Book Maniac. What do you think? I don't know if I'm intuitive either, but I see my role as a booktuber as expressing to the best of my ability my subjective reaction to what I read, and then people who know my taste and don't to what degree their taste and my taste overlap can make their decisions. And I think I have a distinct subset of subscribers who have almost polar opposite tastes to mine, and they're looking for the books that I trash or bail on because they might be the books that they would like. So yeah, subjectivity from beginning to end.
So 3 very different opinions there.
Yeah. Why did we group them together?
Well, I think they're all impacted by, their initial ideas of what it is to BookTube. For Hannah, it's clearly about creating ongoing conversation about literature. For Sean, it is about sharing his experience.
For Elle, it's also a little bit about sharing her experience too. But I think that this idea of keeping in mind your goals on BookTube and why are you even on BookTube in the first place, and keeping that conscious
Definitely
in your reviews is
I think
is cool.
And maybe that's one of the reasons why I'm having a conundrum at this point in my life, because when we first started doing BookTube, my main objective was to make more space in my life for reading. I've hit a point where I've kind of done that. Like, I can do it more, and I plan to improve that, but I've gone from reading 1 book a year to reading, this year I'll probably get close to 70. That is a huge shift in how much of my life is dedicated to reading, and a really positive one. But now BookTube, I guess, has a different purpose for me.
That, honestly, BookTube is probably eating into your reading time.
Yeah, for sure.
Courtney had something quite unique to say.
Yeah, and something that I think is super applicable to both of us.
Definitely the language that I use to indicate the quality serves to reinforce or justify my star rating of a book. That's, for the most part, the language that I tend to, again, fairly consistently use as a kind of informal scale in my ratings and reviews. I did also want to add here that I feel like I tend to be more negative rather than positive in my reviews, even of books that I like even if I give a book 4 stars and I say, several good things about it, I'll still tell you, and this is the thing that kept it from being a 5-star book or higher or whatever. And I think that's probably just my academic background. We tend to be very critical of things in academia. So I wanted to also put that in there just as some food for thought.
I think a lot of booktubers are guilty of this. I think that we all include 100% of the negative things that we notice and 10% of the positive.
When you're giving out a star rating, when you're considering the positive and negative of it, I don't star rate the TV shows that I watch. So I'm not interested in whether they're a 5 or a 4-star or a 3-star or whatever. I don't notice the flaws in it. I don't notice what they could have done better. I just, at the end of the day, basically give it a thumbs up or a thumbs down. That is it. But because we are star rating, we'll all have favourite books by an author or favourite books in a series or whatever.
I do struggle with comparing and ranking books. That's one of the reasons why I run away from the star rating system, because I think no matter how much you try to keep it from becoming a ranking, it is ultimately a ranking of your 5 stars above your 4 stars above your, and those are not always books that you would naturally compare. I think that this aspect of being more negative because we're conscious of reviewing and ranking, that for me is part of why star ratings detract from the experience, because they do draw your focus to what is wrong rather than letting you sit and marinate in what is right about a book.
I think one of the things that sort of stands out to me with Courtney saying that is I have had, when I haven't revealed what my star rating was, or even if I have, when I've discussed why a book is 4 stars instead of 5 stars, I've had people say, "Oh, I'm sorry you didn't like that book," or whatever. I'm like, no, I did. It was a 4-star read, solid, good book, but...
It's definitely comments like that contribute to my idea of a need for this kind of communication, because I think that often people hear one negative thing and they think that means the whole book was...
Yeah.
And a simple graphic communication is something we're all used to absorbing now, and I wonder if the YouTube audience, maybe...
But when I like a book, I make an effort to convey that in my language, which I think then exaggerates how much I like the book as well.
Yeah.
It's a little bit of a...
It's a rabbit warren. This is all a big conundrum, I'm telling you. I'm not just going too deep and wasting my time and making myself crazy. This is complicated.
Also, I think that this will play an effect. We're Australian. Lots of our viewers are from the States, Canada, Europe, the UK, all over the world. We've got viewers from...
I think I notice in particular the difference between the scale of language in Australia versus the US in particular. They are so understated compared to our natural way of expressing ourselves.
If I said, oh, it's just a bit shit, that actually does not mean it's the worst book ever. But in other countries...
that might...
Oh... that could have been a 4-star book. Like
it's only a bit shit.
It's a bit shit. Like, could have had other good qualities in it. We don't have an international language, and maybe with... I think this is a little bit of a tangent, but if you look at how accents change, they sort of pick a central point, and then the accents slowly move in towards that central point. So if you look at the south of England, all the accents move in towards London.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think that that's going to happen with accents, with more and more of this global community online, that probably the American accent will become a dominant accent, although saying the American accent might make American viewers go, oh, which one?
Midwestern, the Hollywood accent.
The Hollywood accent, okay.
Hollywood neutral.
Hollywood neutral. It's going to outdo the BBC accent, is it? Anyway.
We'll see.
I think that will have to happen with language as well. I wonder if that same evolution will happen.
Well, I hope I'm not here to see that, because I really enjoy the vibrant differences between all of our booktubers and how they rate and rank and review books.
Yes, and I still think even within a society, people will use language differently.
Yeah, of course. So, do star ratings and language have a link for all of our panellists?
Is it sort of measured, scientific, consistent? Well, it's quite spontaneous how I describe books because I don't script what I say. Actually, I think it's pretty consistent. I think you get a jolly good idea of whether I've really, really enjoyed or really valued or really rated a book by the language I use.
The language I use when I talk about star ratings and sort of the quality of a book, I mean, it's fairly consistent, I guess, but it does sort of shift because obviously for some books I think it's different things are needed. So there are some books where, for example, Leah Yippie's Free is a book where the childlike narration of the book and then the sort of the coldness and sort of detachment later in the book, for me that elevated the book to being much higher. But typically I would find a childlike narrator quite off-putting, so I think the fact that it was married together with something else makes me okay with it. So I'm fairly consistent, I like to think, in terms of the things I talk about and the things I sort of like to see in books, but I suppose I am open to the idea that often different things can work for different books. I sometimes quite like a sort of meandering, sort of rambly style as how I talk. But for example, that happened once in a non-fiction book I was reading about environmental racism, and it kind of took away from the book for me because it made it feel a little bit less certain. Whereas, for example, I think a book that is a bit sort of meandering and rambly in the right way and sort of Virginia Woolf sort of style thing is also something that I'd be really into. So I think there's kind of consistency in the sort of terms I think I like for certain genres or certain types of book, but that can vary quite a lot. And sometimes an author can just do it, but extremely well, even if it's something that I wouldn't normally enjoy, and that will change. But typically I think the language I use particularly when I think about star ratings, is fairly consistent maybe, because sort of for me a 5-star has to feel like it is changing something, or it's kind of just very well done. It doesn't feel like there isn't that much room for it to really be improved, or at least that I could enjoy it more. But I think for sort of books where things haven't worked, I think that's also fairly consistent. It's normally the same thing for me, that parts of the plot don't make sense, or the writing felt weak, or it felt like it wasn't particularly cleverly thought out, or things like that. So
with Roz, we said early on because certain words clearly mean certain things to her, that she must be consistent. And actually Bob fits into that quite well as well, because
Yeah, for sure. I think it's I think their styles are actually quite similar, so I'm not super surprised that they're together in this little bucket of well, my opinion's the same, so of course my rating matches my language.
yes, quite a few people started to talk about this idea of whether they give intuitive reviews. So let's see what they said.
It is intuitive. There is no scale here. It is just how I feel about a book.
I think it's all intuition. I don't think you could come at book in a measured way, because every single book that you've read, be that the same author, be that in the same genre, be that in the same theme, in the same history, everything is going to influence your choice of words. Therefore, you're going to have to be instinctive of how you want to convey that in relation to everything else. I think if you're measured, if it's just rubric, if it's just standard, wouldn't you lose the impact when talking about the review? If you're consistent, many things to worry about.
I think that this is really interesting. I'm using that word again. I agree with Kieran that everything that you read or do shapes you as a person. That affects the language that you use, and no two paths are going to be the same. But I also agree with Bob and Roz that it is completely consistent because those words mean something to them. And I don't think that that's...
I don't think that's a contradiction.
It appears a contradiction, but it's not.
I think it can be both intuitive and consistent. The idea that intuition is less accurate as a form of thinking is... Well, I have a problem with that idea in general. But I do think that less structured, more spontaneous reviews are a different style, I guess, to, say, someone like Olivia, who's clearly very... Considered. If we've decided that intuition and consistency aren't opposites, then what's our other set of opinions? Because we're still missing some YouTubers.
Sean has said he doesn't think it's intuitive.
He's laughed. No, I think he's laughed at the idea that he's consistent because he's a maniac. Sean, what were you saying?
Yes, there are things as professional book reviewers, and their reviews too are completely subjective. Otherwise, you wouldn't have 5 professional book reviewers having 5 different opinions on the same Pulitzer Prize-winning book. So it's absolutely subjective. Some people do it better than others, and I admire them for their book reviewing skill, and they get paid for it. Thus, they are a professional.
So what he's saying is he wants to start a fight.
So I think he does want to start a fight with professional reviewers. But I think there is something quite interesting in this to come out of this. These 9 people we have picked as one of the criteria is we enjoy how they review books. At no point when we were discussing who we were going to ask did we go, that person is accurate.
No, absolutely not. The idea of accuracy is not something that we consider. I guess effective communication is what we're looking for. Engaging communication.
I think engaging is...
I think, I mean, that's part of what gets your message across. I'm still listening to you because you're kind of funny, and if you're just reciting the characteristics of a book in a monotone, then I'll probably be asleep before you get to the end of your list.
It's something that everybody hates, and people get defensive when they do it, but everybody hates you grabbing the book and reading the blurb. Why do people hate that? Well, it's because
you're disengaged.
Yeah, exactly. It says nothing. That I think is what Sean is getting at.
I think it's a very valid contribution to this discussion.
Exactly.
Despite the fact that he's clearly picking a fight.
He's clearly picking a fight. But I think the best reviewers are not the reviewers that are the most accurate or say the most insightful things about the books. They're the reviewers that get the most people to buy the paper or to read their reviews, or there is a capitalist slant to it. And that, look at the news we watch. Is that necessarily good and accurate news? No. Is it clickbaity news? Yes. Does that... So, reviewers should be more clickbaity is what we're coming down to.
Okay, right. I don't know if that's advice I want to take.
This book made me want to stab my eyes out like I was Oedipus.
I mean,
Actually,
says Scott, like, that's not how he talks.
Yeah, that's rather tame. All right, let's see what Olivia has to say.
As I don't really script anything when it comes to talking about my middle star reads that I mentioned, it's all intuitive. It's just me talking about how I like to book. But when it comes to my 1 and 5 stars, it's very formal. It definitely means what it means.
I think Olivia's approach is my favourite. I think the more times that we come down to it and see what she's talking about, the more I'm really in tune with this balance of off-the-cuff, impressionistic discussion of books balanced with sort of like a nerdy scale that's actually built for effective communication rather than arbitrary sticking to the nerdy scale.
What is interesting with Olivia's opinion? Oh, I can't stop using that word.
At the end of this, we'll be putting up a list of synonyms for interesting.
Hey, what other words do we overuse that you've noticed that you just want to give me a complex about? She has said that she's intuitive for her middle reads and she's not intuitive for her 1 and 5
I don't think that's
but
true.
That's not what she... Yeah, she's talking about as a representation of her opinion.
Yeah.
And that, therefore, means that it is... Am I being intuitive when discussing my intuitive opinion? Which is a really meta thing.
This whole thing is a meta conversation, though.
But it's that means that Olivia, is... I mean, she's obviously, if you watched her video, she's very well considered with what she's speaking. And I know when I found out that she doesn't script her videos, I was like, really?
Yeah.
She's so well considered. But
also just a beautifully spoken person.
Yeah. So the fact that just comes out of her mouth normally is...
Not fair. Is what that is. It's not fair.
I think it's really cool that she's very considered and formulaic with some of her reviews and very intuitive with others. How interesting is that?
I think that there are aspects of her reviews that she would be intuitive the whole time. I think even when she's talking about a 5-star book, she still describes it in that same style and that same quite considered, but clearly her own experience and her own intuition about other people's impressions and that sort of thing. It's the ranking that becomes formulated, and only the ranking.
Yes. Let's let Pay have the last word on this, shall we?
I don't know, should we?
I assume anyone that's watching something I do on literary criticism or theory would expect language that's typically more held for an academic setting. Whereas when discussing science fiction novels, I try to stay away from that. But again, it's not so much that I try; it's just that it is more intuitive. So if I didn't answer the questions properly, I hope it still in some way can contribute to the conversation. Well, maybe they find this interesting. Shut up.
Coming soon to a theater near you.